A reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, verses 12 through 23. Now when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, on the road by the sea across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and for those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. From that time Jesus began to proclaim, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." As he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Jesus went through Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and every sickness among the people.
I want to talk today about the calling of our fishermen in our story today, but I want to start off with telling you a little bit about myself. I've been called twice in my life by God to do something in service. Now, the second time, it took 17 years of work for God for me to hear that call. And that was my call to ministry. It took 17 years for that to really come into fruition. It started back in the 1990s, and it moved forward very incrementally, very slowly, almost without me seeing it, to get me to the point where I'm standing here today. But my first call, it was August of 1975. I was 17 years old, this was the summer between my junior and my senior year in high school. I had a girlfriend who lived about 20 miles away across town, and I lived in Riverside, California, down in Southern California. So I would get on my bike. I had a five-speed spider bike that was really fast and short and could get me where I needed to go without a whole lot of energy. And I was heading across town to go visit my girlfriend. She had a pool in the backyard. I had my swim clothes on underneath my clothes. I was ready for the day. And it was August, so it was hot. I had gone about 10 of the 20 miles I needed to go, and I was in downtown Riverside, going through what was known as the Plaza Mall. And along the way, there was this poster board, one of those sandwich board things that you see outside of a shop. And there was this Uncle Sam standing there with his finger out. Wants you. And I saw that, and I've been thinking about what I wanted to do with myself. And this is between my junior and my senior year. I had really no prospects for college. My family couldn't afford to send me, and I didn't have work that would get me through college. And so I knew that wasn't really an option at that moment in my life. And I stopped my bike, and I pulled it off, and I thought about it. I stood there for a moment, and I just felt I needed to do this. And so, now this was Uncle Sam standing out there. It wasn't some Marine poster or some Army guy. This was just Uncle Sam. So I walked into the recruiting office. And there were 4 doors. As I walked into the main hallway, there were 4 doors. One on each side. There was 2 on each side as I was walking down the hallway. And I looked in the first door, and there was this guy in a blue suit. That's what it looked like to me, a blue suit. And he had Air Force stripes on. If you were in the Air Force, I do not mean this to be derogatory, but this was my perception at the moment. That includes for the other 3 branches of service I want to mention. So I looked in the door, and here was this guy wearing a blue suit. That looked okay. But it was just a blue suit with stripes on it. Okay. I looked over the other side, and here was this guy, and he was wearing kind of a khaki shirt and greenish trousers, and he looked a little sloppy, and he had a couple of ribbons on and a couple of shooting badges, and he just a little sloppy. So I walked past the Army. And then I looked to the right over here, and here was this guy in a white suit. He was wearing white. And he was a little overweight, kind of went over his belt a little bit. And I said, no, that didn't suit me. Navy didn't look right. And I looked on this side over here, and here was this guy in a khaki shirt with stripes. He had a bunch of stripes on his sleeve and a row of ribbons up to his shoulder board. And he's standing like this, looking down at his desk, and he's reading while standing like this. And he looked sharp. I mean, he had a straight line down here like this. He had this rows of ribbons. He was slim, trim, muscles. Just, boy, he looked good. I saw that, and I said, now that's what I need. That's what I need. I need that kind of discipline. I was raised without a father. And so I didn't know what it meant to have a father figure around. And I saw this man that looked exactly like what I remembered from my childhood growing up, looking at Gomer Pyle and seeing Sergeant Carter. This is what these are the things that went through my mind as I'm standing there, a 17-year-old who grew up with Gomer Pyle. And so, of course, the Marines were kind of right there in the front for my head because I remember Gomer Pyle. My uncle had served in the Air Force. My dad had served in the Army, but I didn't know that until years later. And so the family was around me, but they had all served in other branches. Nobody in my family had ever served in the Marines. And I looked at that guy and I said, this is it. This is what I need to do. This is what's pulling me to do something with my life that isn't going to just be a waste. And I went in and I talked to the guy. And he said, okay. He was excited. This was in 1975. The draft had ended. They were no longer drafting people into the military. This was all volunteers that were joining up now. These weren't people who were drafted. These are people who wanted to join. And so this recruiter, who probably hadn't been very busy all day, because he was standing here like this, just not doing anything except reading, I figured he was probably not getting a whole lot of recruits at that time. Because this was right at the beginning of the all-volunteer military. And so he was excited because this young 17-year-old had walked into the office and started talking to him. So we sat down and we discussed and we talked. And he says, well, I can get you in, but your mom's going to have to sign your parents are going to have to sign the paper because you're only 17. I said, okay. So I went on to my girlfriend's and spent the rest of the afternoon, got home that evening, mentioned it to my mom, who of course had this terrified look on her face as I'm describing my discussion with this Marine recruiter. Of course, my mom had this terrified look on her face. She really did. She was really frightened for me because she again heard, she was again raised, as I was growing up, watching Vietnam on television every night. And so these are the things that ran through my mother's mind. Vietnam, what they were doing there. And so these are the things that went through my mom's mind. And mom was going like, oh no, what has my son done? But the recruiter showed up a few days later. Mom agreed, after a long discussion, Mom agreed to let me sign the papers as long as I finished high school. And that was the rule. I had to finish high school. And the recruiter says, okay, we'll put you on a 9-month delayed enlistment program. We can finish out high school, and then once you've graduated high school, you can head off to boot camp in September. Okay, sounds great. Mom said, okay, sounds great. So that's what happened. Mom signed the paperwork, and I'm now officially a Marine. Untrained, not gone to boot camp or any of that kind of stuff, but I signed the paperwork. But that wasn't the end of the story. I'd gone to church. I was a full-time member of Calvary Temple in Riverside, which was an Assemblies of God church. Knew the pastor. In fact, the young woman that I had gone to go visit, a young girl I'd gone to go visit, was his daughter. That was my girlfriend at the time. And I went to church and I mentioned it to the church that I had joined the Marines. And there was a little shock and, of course, fear and all that kind of stuff that I got from my friends and relatives that went to the church. And I went home. And it was a couple of months had gone by. And the next thing I know, Pastor Bennett called me up and said, Stephen, I want to do something with you. I says, I've got somebody I want you to meet. Oh, okay. So he shows up at my house, and I get in his Volkswagen Beetle, and we head off to wherever he's taking me. He takes me to this building, downtown Riverside, and it's an architectural firm. It's a big architectural firm in Riverside. He walks me in. Now, just so you know, the little background here is that during high school, I took architecture in high school. And I had drawn up enough building designs and so forth, and they had been sent off to the Orange County Fair and things like this for reward. And I had won all kinds of awards for my architectural drawing. I even created new homes and things out of whole cloth, and these were graded, and I was really doing well. And so I didn't know it, but Pastor Bennett had talked to this architectural firm, and they had agreed to look at my work and discuss with me a future. So I went, and we discussed, and we talked, and they offered me a scholarship to the University of California in Riverside. They offered me an apprenticeship with their architectural firm. And this was Pastor Bennett's attempt to get me out of this Marine contract. Okay? That was his attempt to do this, to find me a different route. And I liked it. It was great. But I still, back here, it was still saying, no, Marines is where you want to be. So, a little more time elapsed. And school started back up, and I went to school, and by this time I was also into singing. And I was part of a chamber singers group. And Sandra Herbert, who used to sing with the Young Americans, was my vocal coach. She was the teacher. And I mentioned it to her, that this is what I was planning to do. And of course, panic went through her face too, because she really liked me. And she was really concerned, and her biggest concern is that they're going to change you. They're going to make you into somebody you are not today. And we really like who you are. And I understood her, what she was saying, but this is what I was going to do. About a month later, I'm in class, we're practicing and everything else, and at the end of the class she says, Stephen, I want you to meet with me this Saturday, and we're going to go do something. Okay. So that Saturday, I went down to school. She picked me up in her car, and we went over to Riverside Community College, RCC, in Riverside. And the director of their music department, who was internationally known, conducted an audition for me. Had me sing for them. Okay, great. I left. I went back to about my business. And a couple of days later, Sandra Herbert came up to me and she says, they've offered you a scholarship to go to RCC in the music department, to be part of their vocal music, part of their choir, for choral music. I said, sounds great. What do you think about it? But back, I mean, it really did. I mean, it's really, both of these opportunities sounded really great and a whole different kind of future for me. But I chose to continue with what I had already planned. And so, in June of 1976, on June 27th, actually a week before that I graduated high school. On June 27th I turned 18. On June 29th I'm standing in San Diego on the Yellow Footprints. And I started with that first calling. The calling to service into the military. I served 20 years. So that was that calling. But the point I want to drive in this is, here is the situation with our fishermen. Here is Andrew and Peter, also known as Simon, also known as Cephas. And they own a couple of fishing boats. These are two brothers that own their own fishing fleet. And there's also James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And Zebedee is the owner of his fishing fleet, and he has his two sons who help him out. And here comes Jesus. He's left. Jesus' ministry up to this point is he had gone down to the Jerusalem area. He had gotten himself baptized. He had wandered around a little bit there, doing little stuff. And then he hears that John the Baptist is been arrested. And he's still in Judea, down around Jerusalem, when he hears that John has been arrested. And so he leaves Judea and heads back up to the Galilee. And we hear in the story then that he also moved. He was living in Nazareth. And he packed up his stuff and he moved to Copernicus. And he stayed and he started living in Copernicus. And that became the center of his ministry work, of his outreach into the community, into the neighborhood, into the area around him. That was where his ministry was, right there in Capernaum, which is on the Sea of Galilee, which is where he meets Andrew and Peter, James, and John. That's where he meets them. Right there in their hometown, his hometown, or where he's decided to live for a while. And so Jesus sees them and he comes up to them and he says, let me make you fishers of people. Let me teach you something different. Let me take you into a different calling than the job you have. And so, the story tells us that they immediately got up and started following Jesus. But you have to remember, they're still in their hometown. They're still in Capernaum, or Copernicus. They're still living right there. It may be the center of Jesus' ministry, but it's still their home. Let's think about this. James and John, their father Zebedee, is there in the community. They were working for their father, learning that trade. I can imagine then that although the story tells us that they immediately got up and started following Jesus, they're still in their hometown most of the time. Can you imagine what pressure was being put on them by their family, by their friends, by those that worked around them or worked with them or worked for them? With the two brothers, Andrew and Peter, they had their own fishing boats. Can you imagine what it was like for them? I would imagine they probably got some of the same kind of discussions that I faced when I decided to join the Marines. Is that, but wait a minute, here's Zebedee, their father, John and James's and John's father, going, but wait a minute, sons, I have this career for you. You can follow me in my footsteps. I have boats. You have a living right here. Why do you need to go off and do this strange thing with this fellow? I can imagine that maybe that's what happened in some of their cases. And they had to resist that other. They had to resist the family and the friends and those that wanted to help them to find them what they thought may be a better path for them. I can imagine Zebedee going, but sons, I have this whole path laid out for you. I have a life laid out for you. You've got boats and fishing and you can do all of these things. You can have a healthy, good life like this. But if you follow this guy, he's going to lead you off into some place else, and I don't know what that's like. Can you make a living that way? Can you raise a family with that? Can you do those things with that? And I imagine the same thing with Peter and his brother Andrew. That his fellow workers, those that worked for them in the boats that they owned, because they owned their own boats, I can imagine that the workers that had, because, it wasn't just, when you work in a fishing boat, it's not just you in that boat. There are others that help you pull in the net or cast out the net or sort the fish. There are others that work with you. And so I would imagine that Peter and Andrew also had workers that worked for them, employees that worked for them. And I can imagine them going, but wait a minute, what's going to happen to us? Don't you have something, you could stay with this and you have us and you could buy more boats and you can just have a wonderful career doing this. But why do you want to go do that? Those are the things that I faced as a young fellow at 17 looking for a future. And I can imagine that's what Peter and James and Andrew and John also felt. That pressure, saying that this calling that you feel maybe isn't a real calling. Maybe that's not what you're supposed to do. Let me give you something else. But as we see in the story, as we move through the Gospels, we find out that they accepted this call. They took that call, and whether it was good or bad for them, they accepted that call and they moved forward with Jesus in that calling. It's not always easy to answer the call. It took 17 years of resistance on my part. I was in some ways not aware of the calling being put on me to move me to here. But in some ways also I felt that pressure. But you should be staying a bookkeeper, an accountant. That's your job. That's what you can do. That's where you can make all this kind of money. And yet, this call, it pulls you. And I don't know, I would imagine all of us at one time or another felt a call like that. It may not have been a call to ministry or a call to service in the military or But I imagine that we all, at one point, somewhere in our life, have felt God call us or pull us toward something different. Something that maybe is even scary. Joining the Marines is not something for the light of heart. It's not something you do out of a whim. It's not something, you have to really think about something like that. Joining the Marines is a scary project. And so I was frightened at the time, but again, that call was so great that it overtook my feelings, it overtook my emotions, it overtook my fear, and allowed me to do this thing anyway. And so I tell you, I ask you to look inside your own lives for those moments when God calls you to do something. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes what God calls us to be is challenged. But it's in that challenge that we grow, that we become new people. We find new ways of expressing and being ourselves, and being in communion and in relationship with God and with each other. And so I encourage you to look for those moments. Reflect back on times when God has called you, and look for those moments in the future where God will call you again